Welcome to the fifth video in our series of quilts and projects using 5-inch squares or charm packs. All you need is one charm pack or 40 squares measuring 5 inches by 5 inches, 1/3 yard for an inner border, and 1 yard for a final border plus the binding. You will also need 1 1/4 yard for backing and batting. At the end of the video, you'll see the Christmas version, but also a sweet pastel version in this party-themed charm pack. From the inner border fabric, cut 4 strips that are 2 inches by the width of fabric. This pattern is called One Charm Pack Plus. It's available free from the Moda Fabrics website. We will leave a link to the pattern in the description below. When I have extra fabric left over after cutting my strips, I will usually cut it down to 2.5-inch strips so that I can add them to my 2.5-inch strip bucket. From the border fabric, cut 4 strips that are 3.5 inches by the width of fabric and 4 strips that are 2.5 inches by the width of fabric. Now that the borders are cut, it's time to arrange the charm squares. The first thing you're going to do is pick the corners first and set them aside. The quilt is made of 6 rows of 6 squares, so I'm going to try to separate out 6 piles, and each pile should have a little bit of every color and design. I try to make sure that each row has some of the background color, some of the gray, some of the red, and some of the green. Some rows will have 2 of red or 2 of green, but I just try to spread out the colors as best I can. I also try to make sure I'm spreading out the designs so I don't have all the words in one row or all the plaids in one row. Kind of separate those out between the rows. Once I have separated out my 6 squares into 6 rows, I'm going to label each of the rows 1 through 6 to keep the pieces together. Any leftover charms go into my extra charm bucket. I found these cute clothespins that have numbers on them in the bargain section at Target. You could also take regular clothespins and just write numbers on them. Now it's time to sew. Make sure you're using 1/4-inch seam allowances. To help stay organized, it's easiest to sew one row at a time. Arrange the colors any way you want and sew the 6 pieces into a row. Spread the colors and the designs around. There is no right or wrong way to sew the squares together. This is all just personal preference at this point, so arrange them in a way that looks good to you. Once the first row is done, lay it out and then use that row as a guide to help you figure out where you want to put the pieces for the second row. Again, I'm going to try to spread around the colors and the designs. It's important to keep organized, so you want to make sure that you put the pins on the right side of the rows as you go along. So my number 1 pin is on the top row and my number 2 clothespin is on the second row. Follow these same steps for each of the 6 rows. Once all 6 rows have been sewn, it's going to be time to press. This is where the pins will come in handy. For all my odd number rows, I'm going to press away from the clothespin. For all my even numbered rows, I'm going to press towards the clothespin. This will help the seams nest together when you're sewing the rows together. Next, we want to sew all of the inner border strips to the outer border strips. If your fabric is directional, you may want to pay attention to which side of the strip, the border strip, you're sewing the inner border to. Mine is going to be a wall hanging, so I'm going to sew 3 of them one direction on one side and the last one on the other so it can be at the top of the quilt. If your fabric is not directional, this step will be a little easier to keep track of. For this particular seam, you can press either towards the inner border, the outer border, or you can press the seam open. I'm choosing to press towards the inner border. Now it's time to do a little measuring. If you've sewn correctly, all the rows should measure 27.5 inches long. I put a couple of rulers end to end just to get my length on the mat. Once I've determined that all my rows are the correct length, then I can cut my border pieces to that same length. All 4 border sections should be cut 27.5 inches long. If, for example, all your rows measure 27 inches long, then you would want to cut your border sections to 27 inches, or whatever measurement matches up with your rows. Now it's time to sew the rows together. Make sure you line those up so that the clothespins are always on the right side and follow the numbers. When sewing the rows together, the seam should nest at the corners where they meet. If you like to, you can also pin at the corners just to make sure everything's perfect. You can either sew all the rows together in order, or you could sew row 1 and 2 together, 3 and 4 together, 5 and 6 together, and then do the first sets together, and then add the third set last. There's a variety of ways to go to get the rows sewn together. Any way that works for you is the best way to do it. You can press the row seams after each seam that you make, or you can wait till all of the rows are put together and press all the seams at once. As I'm sewing the rows together, I will usually press as I go so that things lay a little bit flatter. Once all the rows are sewn together and the seams are pressed, it's time to add the border pieces. Piece 2 of the border sections to opposite sides of the quilt top. I highly suggest pinning the border section to the quilt top. I will pin in the middle and then on each end and then kind of ease it through the center of the quilt. Pinning will help keep all the edges even, and at the end you won't end up with an inch of border hanging off the quilt top. Once the border sections are added onto the quilt top, you want to press towards the borders. Find those 4 squares that we set aside at the very beginning, and we're going to sew these onto opposite ends of the 2 remaining border sections. Once the squares are added onto the ends of the border sections, you're going to press towards the border sections. Once everything is pressed, it's time to add the last 2 border sections onto the quilt top. I highly recommend pinning the border sections onto the quilt top before you sew. When pinning the border to the side of the quilt, I start on the ends where I have seams that I have to match up, and then I will do the middle of the quilt and the quilt border, and then I kind of ease it as I go and fill in the sections. Once the last 2 border sections have been added to the quilt top, you want to press towards the borders. Once the quilt top is pressed, layer the quilt top with batting and backing and quilt as desired. I used a fun plaid Christmas print set on point for the back of this quilt. The Christmas quilt was quilted from the back side by following the lines of the plaid using a walking foot. I picked some lines of the plaid and used thread that matched the front and the back and just quilted right on the lines, going each direction. Once your quilt top is quilted and trimmed, it's time to add the binding. Sew the binding strips together end to end using a diagonal seam. When pressing the binding strips, press the seams open. This will spread out the seam along the binding edge. A straight seam will create a bump on the edge of the quilt. For this quilt, I attached the binding to the quilt top, then I pressed it around to the edge to the back side of the quilt and top stitched it from the front side and caught it on the back underneath the quilt top. When I stitch in the ditch along the very edge of the quilt binding so that I catch it on the back side, it almost looks from the front like I did it by hand, but it's all done by machine. I may end up using this one for a wall hanging, so I'm very happy that I got the top and bottom border pieces to be directional so that they can hang up and look nice. When putting together this pink version, I decided that it was probably going to either be used as a baby quilt or as a table topper, so when I was putting the rows together, I didn't pay attention to the direction of the prints. So some of them are going upside down, right to left. It didn't matter because I didn't need it to be a directional kind of quilt. It was all the same steps as I used for the Christmas quilt, making sure I spread out the colors and the designs. Making a second quilt usually goes a little bit quicker than trying it for the first time. If you wanted to enlarge this pattern just a little bit, you could, instead of doing 6 rows of 6 charms, you could do up to 8 rows of 8 charms. You'd have to have a whole nother charm pack, but you could still have enough outer border fabric without having to purchase more of that. If you did an 8 by 8 instead of 6 by 6 and still had charms in the corners, you'd have enough border fabric and it would measure about 45.5 inches by 45.5 inches. The pattern as it's written ends up being 36.5 inches by 36.5 inches. To quilt this version, I used a serpentine stitch and then followed the lines of the quilt top. Some lines were straight, just following the seams, and some I did on an angle. For this binding, I also stitched it on the front and top stitched it from the front to catch it on the back. We hope that you will remember to hit the like button, leave a comment for us, share with your quilting friends, and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and happy quilting!